If you celebrate any of the winter holidays coming up this season, you might, like me perhaps, be in the process of forming to-do lists. Perhaps the central holiday tradition. I go all in on Christmas in particular, and I love the traditions of it, the decorations and events and carols that are reliably the same every year. But despite the sameness that is so much a part of the holiday magic of any holy day and holiday, there are still somehow so many decisions to make. My to-do list these days is full of scheduling things a little differently or planning a little differently than last year. And in particular, I am always aware that every few years there are some new friends and new family participating to include, and there are also, every few years, some folks no longer with us for the gatherings. Every year at this time, I think a lot about what is the same and what's different. Ever since I first arrived in New England, about 20 years ago now, my Midwestern prairie heart has been enamored with the ocean. Knowing of my fascination with the sea, my mom, who is visiting from the Midwest this weekend, gave me a very special present for my 40th birthday last year. She bought me a ticket for a 4-day excursion out on the actual ocean in an actual tall ship. This boat is the oldest schooner still on the water. It's a gaff-rigged, topsail, double-masted schooner. And I don't know what any of that means, but I'm sure it's all just a way of saying that it's really old-timey. And so it came to pass that I spent 4 days last year on this huge, wonderfully old boat, built in 1871. Thank you, Mom. And one morning, I was sitting in this crowded little kitchen below deck, and I noticed this huge wooden beam across the center of the boat. It was labeled with the original serial number of the ship. I turned to Captain Becky, our fearless leader, and I asked, how much of the ship is actually original to 1871? Well, she said, she put her hand up on that big wooden beam and she said, this beam here. Also, maybe the iron bell at the top of the mast, she added. I was floored. This oldest schooner on the water was almost all new. You might be familiar with the ship of Theseus, a thought experiment handed down to us from the Greek philosophers of old. According to legend, Theseus was the great founder of the city of Athens. And so the people of Athens kept his ship in a harbor, in the city harbor, and they would take it out once a year for a special religious pilgrimage to honor the city and honor their great founder. And after a few hundred years of maintaining the ship, replacing the planks as they rotted away one by one, some of these Greek philosophers began to wonder, if at some point every part of the ship has been replaced, is it still the same boat? Is it still Theseus's ship, really? Now, if you aren't embarking on any old-timey sailboats yourself, the question of Theseus's ship might feel distant. But this same question shows up in our religious lives, in our spiritual lives. And in my own spiritual community of Boston, Sanctuary Boston, we begin every worship with these words of welcome that include the saying, whether you've been hurt by religion, saved by it, or some of both, we welcome you. And I suspect that for many of us here, our experience of religion has been some of both. And religions, by and large, are a lot like old ships. They are passed down through the generations, and they are constantly in need of maintenance and renovations. Now, religious conservatives will deny that renovations are necessary, but progressives understand that religion is always being updated, and that's what keeps them seaworthy. That's what keeps them useful, able to make the pilgrimage. When some folks say they want to be spiritual but not religious, it might be because there is a dangerous amount of rot in the tradition that they were born into. And there are 1,000 good reasons to want a clean break from institutional religion. I can understand not wanting to renovate a leaky old boat that was built for another time, particularly because the work of rebuilding has to be done while you are already out at sea on life's great voyage. But friends, the ocean isn't necessarily safer alone in a rowboat either. The role of tradition is to make present the wisdom of generations past, as we heard in our reading. And then our role is to apply the tradition to the moment we're in for nothing less than our survival and certainly our liberation. I'll say this, I'm glad that I didn't try to spend 4 days on the ocean in a 150-year-old boat that hadn't been replaced with any parts since it was made. Because in fact, there aren't any boats still afloat anywhere from 150 years ago for whom that's true. And there aren't any religions around that haven't changed in the last 150 years either. And one of my earliest memories of witnessing this kind of evolution of religious community was in my high school youth group. For the 4 years I was in high school, my youth group was the touchstone of my week. I sometimes picture that time as when you're trying to cross a stream in the forest and you stand on one rock and you jump to the next one and jump to the next one. For me, my youth group, every Wednesday night, was the landing on the rock, in between the flying through the air of life. It was a landing, it was a safe place to land. Every Wednesday night we'd gather and we would do a check-in that was absurdly long. I have this sense that other youth groups would do like activities or have topics of discussion. For us, it was just a really long check-in, and I loved it. That space to listen so deeply, to speak and be heard by my people, it was liberating, and it was soul-saving. But then, after I had graduated high school, I was gone for a year, and in the midst of college, I came home for summer break one evening, and I visited that Wednesday night youth group. And you're not going to believe this, but there were all these new people there. And these new people, these young people, who I didn't even know, they talked about the shallowest things all night long. I spent the whole evening mourning the loss of this once valuable group, thinking about how as soon as my generation had left, the whole thing had fallen into disrepair. And then, at the end of the meeting, after 90 minutes of unspiritual, unmeaningful, and boring conversation, this one kid in the group says to everyone, he says, this is the only place where I can really be myself. And if it wasn't for this place, I don't know what I would do. And at the time, can I be honest, just between us? At the time I thought, kid, you don't even know what spiritual is. But today, with some distance though, I wonder if maybe spiritual depth and real connection isn't always something you can see from the outside. And maybe the youth group had fallen into disrepair. Maybe it was only a fragment of its former self. But maybe, friends, even a fragment of unconditional love is still enough to transform somebody's world. Or maybe traditions evolve and culture changes, and growing up requires some openness to that change, to considering that what worked for you isn't what will work for the next generation. Some people will tell you that a holiday tradition is a thing that stays the same year after year. Some religious people will tell you that a religious community is something that stays the same and is always constant. Some love songs, for that matter, will tell you that a person never changes. Dear ones, it's all baloney. Every one of them, they're just Theseus's old ship. I had this feeling again recently, that returning to visit the youth group after you've aged out feeling. For as long as I can remember, my own Unitarian-Universalist tradition has been most clearly defined by our 7 principles. And I say as long as I can remember because, to my horror, I learned just recently that I am only 3 years older than the principles. They have served as the central beam, the serial number of Unitarian Universalism for 38 years now. These 7 principles have been enshrined in Article 2 of the UU Association's bylaws, but our association will likely vote to replace them this coming June at our annual meeting. And I'll be honest, I was not a fan of this news when I first heard it. I have my own long list of things that I wish were different about my larger faith community. In fact, most of my adult life has been pushing and pulling at this living tradition of Unitarian Universalism. I've been trying to rebuild this creaky old boat in my own way for a long while now. So I was embarrassed to hear this all too familiar voice come from my own heart when I heard this news about the famous Article 2, and I heard this little voice say, well, sure, I want change, but not that change. And after wrestling with these feelings, and, well, to be honest, after the 14th Facebook post about it came across my screen, I finally decided to click the link and read the new proposal. And you know, most of the words proposed for the newly renovated bylaws were familiar. Words like justice and equity and interdependence. There was a new word, though, that stuck out to me. The word transformation. It says, we covenant to collectively transform and grow spiritually and ethically. Openness to change is fundamental to our Unitarian and Universalist heritages, never complete and never perfect. Changing our principles to state that we are open to change is a good change. And it seems apparently it is a reminder that I could use. There's one other part of that gaff-rigged sailboat that Captain Becky later mentioned might be original. The wood at the bottom of the hull, the wood that is closest to the sea, the part that's always underwater lasts longer because bacteria doesn't have the oxygen to grow there. Somehow it doesn't surprise me that the part of the boat most central to keeping it afloat, which is, after all, a boat's most central purpose, it doesn't surprise me that those planks have staying power, even though they are hidden underneath, invisible to a tourist like me. Maybe what's most important isn't always what's most visible when you first look at a tradition, or a community, or a person. There's another word that will likely be added to our UU values this year, the word love. Love wasn't in the principles before. Or at least it wasn't visible in the writing. Perhaps we could feel it there underneath. Now it will be at the center, where it belongs, keeping everything else afloat. I used to be captivated by this question of Theseus's ship. But now when I think of that old boat in Athens harbor, I think it doesn't matter much if we call it Theseus's or not. What matters is that it's able to make the pilgrimage. What matters is that it's seaworthy. What matters is that each new generation is able to take what was handed down to them and make use of it for their own survival and perhaps liberation. The important thing about a sacred text isn't winning an argument over what it was supposed to mean 1,000 years ago. The important thing is whether it makes you a more loving person this year. The important thing about a holiday tradition isn't whether we do it the same way that we did it last year. It's whether the sameness or differentness offers us some warmth and some light in a season of cold and dark. Dear ones, if you have been hurt by the religion that raised you, know that it is okay to leave and make a clean break. And know also that it's okay to replace the rotten parts, even if that means that a sturdy beam at the center and maybe some old planks below are all that's left of the original. And if you have been saved by a religion that offered you at least a fragment of unconditional love when you needed it the most, hand that fragment down to someone else. Hand it to the next person in whatever form they need it. Beloveds, may we make this ship anew as we sail it together. May we grow together toward love and liberation. May it be so. May we make it so. Amen.